It started with a call that no one wanted to answer. The kind of call where the voice on the other end is polite, calm, but carries a weight that immediately makes your stomach drop. By the time they hung up, everything the detectives thought they knew about the case had been thrown into question. But at that moment, they didn't realize it yet. They thought they were closing in on the truth. They were about to find out how wrong you can be when the truth is hiding in plain sight. The town itself was small, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else. People left doors unlocked and trusted the mail carrier with their lives. The family at the center of this story was no different. They lived in a modest house on a quiet street. The father worked at a nearby factory, the mother was a school teacher, and their daughter had just started high school. Everything about them screamed ordinary. Neighbors described them as friendly. The kids played in the yard, the dog ran loose in the evenings. People would borrow sugar or eggs without a second thought. There were no signs of trouble. And that's what made what happened next so hard to grasp. It began with small things, little inconsistencies that almost didn't register. A missing mail package here, a strange car idling too long across the street there. Nothing that screamed danger, just enough to make someone notice and quickly file it away in the back of their mind. The family had invited a friend over one evening, someone the parents had known for years. He seemed harmless. Polite, attentive, funny in a way that made the kids laugh. You could tell right away that the parents trusted him. They left him alone with the kids while they went to run errands. Nothing seemed out of place, and nothing appeared unusual at the time. But later, when one of the neighbors mentioned seeing the man a few blocks away at odd hours, and another neighbor remembered him asking questions about the family's routines, the detectives took note. Odd, yes, but not alarming. Not yet. And in this kind of case, patterns often emerge only when you know where to look. It was during a routine check that they found the first tangible clue. Something minor, almost trivial. An unmarked envelope tucked under the edge of a mailbox, addressed to no one. Inside, there were notes that seemed random at first, dates, times, locations. Nothing outright threatening. But as the detectives started to connect them to the family's movements, a subtle unease crept in. They interviewed the friend again. His story was consistent. Calm, confident, rehearsed. He explained away each question, smiled at the idea of being suspected. And the detectives, experienced and careful, found themselves believing him. Almost. By then, the first half of the investigation had unfolded in a quiet rhythm. A few sleepless nights, a handful of interviews, careful checks on social media, and slow mapping of the events. It was precise work. And through it all, the family remained unaware. They continued their routines, believing that life was ordinary, safe. That's the trick about trust, you don't notice when it's being broken until it's too late. Small contradictions began to show up. Little things, a story about where he had been that didn't quite match his credit card records, a detail about the doctor's schedule that didn't add up. Each one minor on its own. But together, they created a pattern the detectives couldn't ignore. And then came the day that changed everything. This is the moment everything changed. The detectives went back to the friend's apartment, expecting perhaps to find a minor inconsistency, maybe a hidden detail that would raise more questions. Instead, they found something entirely unexpected. Something that completely flipped the case on its head. Inside, the apartment was ordinary. Neat, unassuming. But as they looked closer, they discovered evidence that pointed not to the friend, but to someone else entirely. Someone who had been so close to the investigation it hurt to realize they had missed it. The notes, the patterns, the inconsistencies, they weren't his. They were carefully planted. Every assumption the detectives had made up to that point, every step they thought brought them closer to the truth, had been based on a mistake. A fatal mistake. And suddenly, the quiet, ordinary town didn't feel so safe anymore. The sense of betrayal was immediate. They had trusted their instincts, their experience, their careful reasoning. But here, in this apartment, they understood how easily they could be misled. The investigation pivoted sharply after that. Days became nights without sleep. Every phone call, every friend, every neighbor, every past interview was re-examined under a new lens. The detectives started to see connections they hadn't noticed before. They tracked down the person who had orchestrated the misdirection. Someone who knew the family well, who could anticipate how the investigation would unfold. Someone who seemed invisible, unremarkable, harmless. But underneath, they were methodical, patient, and terrifyingly clever. As the detectives closed in, the tension became palpable. They moved faster, making sure every step was precise. Short meetings turned into long stakeouts. Every decision felt urgent. Every choice could be the difference between uncovering the truth or letting the culprit slip away. Meanwhile, the family, still unaware, continued their daily life. But now, the detectives were seeing the cracks that had been invisible before. Small disturbances, a call that came at the wrong time, a package that didn't arrive. The ordinary details, which had once felt safe, now felt like warning signs. They began to understand just how elaborate the deception had been. The notes, the observations, the inconsistencies, they were all part of a carefully constructed web designed to draw suspicion away from the true culprit. Someone who had studied them, someone who had orchestrated the situation with patience and precision. By now, the tension in the town was tangible. The quiet streets felt heavy. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when the topic arose. Even those who hadn't been involved could sense that something was profoundly wrong. Then, as the detectives pieced together the timeline, they realized the final, disturbing truth: they had almost accused the wrong person entirely. They had been ready to bring charges, to ruin someone's life, based on false leads. And only by sheer luck, and a second look at the evidence, did they catch the mistake in time. The sense of relief was tempered by disbelief. How close had they come? How easily had the truth been hidden in plain sight? How ordinary and harmless everything had seemed until the layers were peeled back. The aftermath was quiet but intense. The family was left shaken, confused, questioning what they had trusted. The detectives, seasoned and careful, were left questioning themselves. Every decision they had made, every assumption they had taken for granted, suddenly felt fragile. And the person responsible? They were still out there, clever, patient, knowing that the detectives had been misled once and that the story wasn't over yet. Investigators moved carefully, knowing that one misstep could undo everything. They had to think several moves ahead. Every new piece of evidence was examined with scrutiny. Every pattern scrutinized. They couldn't rely on instinct alone. Not again. And in the quiet moments, after long days of interviews and evidence analysis, the detectives would replay the early stages of the investigation in their minds. The things they thought were ordinary. The little clues they had dismissed. The moments they had assumed were nothing. They all seemed different now. They all seemed sinister in ways that were almost impossible to articulate. The town, meanwhile, returned to a semblance of normal. Life went on, the children played, the neighbors chatted. But beneath the surface, people were more cautious. They noticed small details they hadn't before. They were polite, but wary. Because once you realize how easily you can be misled, you never see the world the same way again. And as the detectives closed the case on the friend they had first suspected, a new chapter began. One that would unravel even more secrets and reveal deeper truths about the people they had thought they knew. The person who had orchestrated the misdirection wasn't finished. In fact, they were just getting started. It was a lesson in patience, perception, and trust. A reminder that even the most ordinary, unremarkable life can hide extraordinary deception. And that sometimes, the hardest part of any investigation isn't finding the truth, it's realizing that you've been wrong all along. The case, as it stands now, remains open in many ways. The detectives have learned to doubt what seems obvious, to question what seems safe. And the town, once so ordinary and predictable, now carries a quiet, persistent unease. People lock doors, check windows, and double-check strangers. The ordinary life they thought they had is gone, replaced by something far more cautious, far more aware. And somewhere out there, the person who fooled everyone watches. Patient. Waiting. Knowing that the next move will matter more than the last, and that the story isn't finished. Not yet. Because sometimes, the moment you think you understand everything is exactly the moment everything can go terribly wrong. And they're still out there, somewhere, silently reminding everyone that even the safest places are vulnerable. When the detectives realized they'd been misled, they didn't just feel frustrated. They felt small. Humans. Fallible. But there was no time to dwell. The person who had orchestrated the deception was still out there. And now, they knew they had to find them before anyone else got hurt. They went back to the beginning, retracing steps they thought were complete. They combed through evidence, revisited interviews, and examined every location the family had gone in the weeks before the first signs of trouble. They had to look past assumptions, past the easy conclusions, and into the spaces that didn't make sense. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. A seemingly insignificant detail, something the detectives had almost overlooked, suddenly snapped into place. It was a receipt, folded and tucked between the pages of a book in the family's living room. It wasn't unusual at first glance, a small purchase at a local store. But the timestamp didn't match the family's story. And that mismatch opened a door. From there, the pieces began to fall into place. The person who had orchestrated the misdirection had been meticulous, planning every step with patience and precision. They'd studied the family, their routines, their habits. They'd known exactly how the detectives would interpret evidence and had manipulated everything to create a false trail. And now, the detectives could see the pattern. They discovered that the culprit had left subtle clues, almost like breadcrumbs, designed not to reveal themselves, but to guide investigators down the wrong path. Every note, every odd behavior that had seemed suspicious, had been carefully staged. And yet, in hindsight, there was a rhythm to it, a pattern that could only be recognized after the fact. The detectives began to track the culprit's movements. Surveillance footage, witness statements, phone records, it all painted a picture of someone who was patient, observant, and dangerously clever. They weren't acting out of desperation or emotion. They were deliberate. Every move is calculated. The family, meanwhile, remained unaware of how close they had come to a false accusation. They were cautious now, naturally. But for them, life went on in quiet, ordinary ways. Dinner at 6. Walk around the block. The dog barked at squirrels. But the detectives knew the stakes were higher than ever. It was a late afternoon when they finally caught a break. A neighbor remembered seeing someone who didn't belong near the house on the day of the first discrepancy. The description matched nothing from the earlier investigation. It was someone entirely new, someone who had carefully avoided attention until that moment. The detectives moved quickly. They coordinated with local law enforcement, planning a careful approach. They couldn't risk another mistake, not now. The culprit had proven they could manipulate perception, and the detectives weren't about to let them do it again. When they finally confronted the person, it was almost anticlimactic. Not because the person wasn't dangerous, but because their demeanor was calm, almost normal. The kind of calm that comes from knowing you've outsmarted people for so long it feels rotting. They didn't resist. They didn't panic. They simply smiled, as if to say, "Yes, you finally caught me. Congratulations." It was during the questioning that the full extent of the deception came to light. The culprit had orchestrated the misdirection not out of malice toward the family, but out of a compulsion they didn't fully understand themselves. They wanted control. They wanted to see if they could manipulate the truth, bend reality just enough to mislead everyone. And they had succeeded, at least for a while. The detectives were stunned. They had expected anger, desperation, maybe even denial. Instead, they faced someone who viewed the entire situation as a puzzle, a game to be solved. And in that realization, the gravity of their near mistake became painfully clear. The confession didn't come all at once. It was slow, careful, and measured. Every word was deliberate. The detectives listened, taking notes, recording details, understanding the methods, the thought process, the planning. It was chilling in its clarity, unsettling in its simplicity. The ordinary veneer had hidden something extraordinary. Once the confession was complete, the detectives began piecing together what the culprit had done. The family had been watched, studied, observed without their knowledge. The letters, the odd behaviors, the small inconsistencies, they were all carefully orchestrated. The detectives realized how close they had come to accusing the wrong person entirely, to destroying an innocent life based on carefully planted lies. It was a humbling moment. A reminder of the limits of perception and the dangers of assumptions. Even experienced investigators can be misled when someone knows exactly how to manipulate expectations. The family was informed in stages. They were shocked, frightened, and relieved all at once. Their trust had been violated in a way that felt almost unimaginable. But they were safe. And for that, they were grateful. In the aftermath, the detectives documented every detail, ensuring that nothing was missed. They wanted to understand not just the how, but the why. How could someone plan and manipulate so carefully? Why choose this family, in this town, at this time? The answers were partly psychological, partly opportunistic, but entirely disturbing. The town, now aware of the deception, changed quickly. People were polite but cautious. Neighborhoods organized watch groups. Strangers were no longer immediately trusted. The ordinary routines, the unlocked doors, the late evening walks, became rare. Everyone had learned something they could never unlearn. Normal can be deceptive, ordinary can be dangerous, and appearances are not always reality. As for the culprit, they were charged with multiple counts of deception, stalking, and obstruction of justice. Their trial was meticulous, carefully presenting the evidence and the confession. The prosecutors emphasized not just the actions, but the psychological manipulation, the meticulous planning, the patient orchestration, the clever misdirection. The case became a cautionary tale in law enforcement circles. Officers were reminded that the most dangerous cases aren't always violent. Sometimes, they are the ones where nothing seems wrong, where everything appears ordinary, and where someone has simply outsmarted everyone. For the detectives, it was a career-defining moment. They had been fooled, almost irreversibly, by a person who was patient, intelligent, and dangerously meticulous. They had to confront the fact that their instincts, their training, and their experience were not infallible. And yet, through persistence, collaboration, and a willingness to question themselves, they had caught the person responsible before anyone was seriously harmed. Even months later, the memory lingered. The family slowly returned to normal routines, but they were forever altered. Their sense of safety had been violated, replaced with cautious awareness. The detectives, too, carried the lessons forward. Every new case was approached with an extra layer of scrutiny, a reminder that deception can be subtle, patient, and nearly invisible. And somewhere in the quiet space of that small town, people would sometimes notice details they hadn't before: a shadow that lingers too long, a car parked in the wrong place, someone asking questions that feel just slightly off. They would remember that ordinary doesn't always mean safe. That normalcy can hide something far more complex. The most unsettling part wasn't the deception itself. It wasn't a near mistake that could have ruined lives. It was the reminder that someone, somewhere, is always capable of seeing through the ordinary, of manipulating it, and of watching from the shadows. And in that thought, the town, the family, and the detectives realized the truth: you can never fully know who's watching, or what they're capable of. Even now, as the case is closed on paper, its lessons remain open in the minds of everyone involved. Because some stories don't end neatly. Some truths linger, persistent, like a shadow just beyond the edge of vision, reminding you that ordinary life is never as simple as it seems. And in the quietest moments, when you think you're safe, that ordinary life is all you have, you can't help but wonder: are you being watched? Are the signs there, and you just haven't noticed them yet? Sometimes, the hardest part isn't surviving the deception. It's living in a world that has shown you it exists. And that is where this story truly ends, for now.